Carl Jung explained, "If you truly value yourself, you'll never settle again." Jung discovered something so dangerous about human psychology that he buried it in his most cryptic writings, hidden beneath layers of academic jargon and symbolic language. It wasn't a theory about dreams or archetypes. It was a terrifying truth about why 90% of people live their entire lives as psychological slaves, not to others but to their own unconscious self-betrayal patterns that keep them accepting scraps when they deserve feasts. He called this the self-worth shadow, the hidden part of our psyche that sabotages our deepest knowing of our own value. And here's what made Jung bury this discovery so deep. He realized that most people would rather die than face the truth about how they've been complicit in their own diminishment. Picture this. You're in a relationship where you give 80% and receive 20%. You stay in a job that slowly kills your soul because it's secure. You apologize for taking up space, feel guilty for having needs, and find yourself grateful for the bare minimum of respect from others. Jung would tell you that this isn't bad luck or low self-esteem. This is your unconscious mind systematically choosing situations that confirm your deepest, most hidden belief that you don't deserve better. Most people spend decades in relationships, jobs, and situations that slowly erode their soul because they've never learned to recognize the difference between their authentic worth and their conditioned worthlessness. But here's where Jung's discovery becomes truly terrifying. This pattern doesn't just happen to you. You actively participate in creating it. Your unconscious mind becomes a heat-seeking missile for people and situations that will validate your hidden belief that you're not worthy of genuine love, respect, or fulfillment. Jung believed this was the most dangerous form of unconscious living because it masquerades as virtue. We call it humility, practicality, or love. We tell ourselves we're being realistic or grateful while secretly destroying the very foundation of our psychological wholeness. The self-worth shadow operates like a psychological immune system in reverse. Instead of protecting you from harm, it systematically rejects anything that would actually nourish your authentic nature. It whispers, "You're asking for too much. Be grateful for what you have. Don't rock the boat. You'll end up alone if you demand better." And the most insidious part? Our culture celebrates this self-diminishment. We're told that wanting more is greedy, that having standards makes us difficult, that true love means endless self-sacrifice. We've created an entire civilization built on the unconscious agreement that we don't deserve better. Jung spent years studying patients who had achieved outward success but felt empty inside. They had money, status, relationships, everything they thought they wanted, but something essential was missing. What he discovered was that they had never learned to distinguish between what they truly wanted and what they thought they should want. They had spent their entire lives performing a version of themselves designed to be acceptable to others. This isn't about becoming selfish or demanding. This is about recognizing that you have been unconsciously colluding with your own psychological imprisonment. And the moment you see it clearly, you can never unsee it. Jung realized that most people die never having experienced what it feels like to truly value themselves, to make choices from a place of genuine self-worth rather than unconscious self-betrayal. They spend their entire existence playing a character designed to keep others comfortable, while their authentic self remains buried alive. But here's what Jung discovered that changed everything. The moment you truly understand your own worth, your entire relationship with reality shifts. You stop attracting people who need you to be small. You stop accepting situations that require you to abandon yourself. You stop mistaking crumbs for love. This isn't about arrogance or narcissism. It's about the terrifying moment when you realize you've been complicit in your own diminishment, and the even more terrifying realization that you have the power to stop. The question isn't whether you deserve better. You already know you do, even if you've spent years convincing yourself otherwise. The question is whether you're brave enough to believe it and act accordingly. Jung's patients who made this shift described it as coming alive for the first time. They said it felt like they had been living behind glass, watching their own life happen without really participating in it. When they began to truly value themselves, the glass shattered. But Jung also warned that this awakening comes with a price. When you stop settling, the people around you who benefited from your self-abandonment will resist. They'll call you selfish, difficult, or changed. Some relationships won't survive your refusal to play your old role. And that's exactly how you'll know it's working. Modern psychology has identified what Jung predicted nearly a century ago, a pandemic of unconscious self-abandonment that's destroying lives at an unprecedented scale. This isn't simple low self-esteem that can be fixed with affirmations and positive thinking. This is what Jung called unconscious self-sacrifice, a complex psychological pattern where individuals systematically choose situations and relationships that confirm their deepest fears about their unworthiness. The symptoms are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. You see them in the woman who apologizes when someone bumps into her, in the man who stays late at work every night, desperate to prove his value through exhaustion, in the partner who gives and gives until they become a ghost of themselves, then wonders why their love isn't reciprocated. Jung observed that this condition creates a vicious cycle where the more we settle, the more we unconsciously believe we deserve to settle, until we can no longer even imagine what authentic self-worth feels like. We become addicted to our own diminishment. What makes this particularly insidious is how our nervous system adapts to chronic self-abandonment. Your body literally rewires itself to feel comfortable with discomfort, to find safety in situations that are slowly killing your soul. You develop what Jung called neurotic accommodation, the ability to convince yourself that psychological starvation is actually contentment. Modern research reveals the devastating scope of this epidemic. Studies show that 75% of people report staying in jobs they hate for years beyond when they knew they should leave. 60% of individuals admit to consistently prioritizing others' needs over their own, even when it causes them significant distress. And here's the most shocking statistic: 80% of people cannot articulate what they actually want from life when asked directly. This isn't personal weakness. This is systematic psychological conditioning that begins in childhood and gets reinforced by every system and institution we encounter throughout our lives. Jung identified several core characteristics of unconscious self-abandonment that most people carry without recognition. The apology reflex, automatically saying sorry for existing, taking up space, having opinions, or expressing needs. This isn't politeness, it's a deeply ingrained belief that your presence is somehow problematic. The gratitude trap, feeling obligated to be thankful for scraps of attention, basic human respect, or the bare minimum of care. You convince yourself that wanting more makes you ungrateful, when in reality, you're grateful for things that should be baseline expectations. The conflict avoidance compulsion, agreeing with others or backing down from your position, not because you've been convinced, but because disagreement feels dangerous to your sense of safety and belonging. The overgiving pattern, compulsively giving your time, energy, money, and emotional support to others while feeling guilty for having needs yourself. You mistake depletion for virtue. The standards erosion, gradually lowering your expectations for how you should be treated until you accept behavior that would have horrified your younger self. This happens so slowly that you don't notice until you wake up one day in a life that feels completely foreign to who you really are. Jung realized that these patterns don't exist in isolation. They form what he called a complex, an autonomous psychological structure that makes decisions for you without your conscious awareness. The self-worth complex operates like a separate personality that hijacks your choices, consistently steering you toward situations that confirm your unworthiness. The most tragic aspect is how this complex protects itself. When opportunities for genuine love, respect, or fulfillment appear, the self-worth shadow whispers, "This is too good to be true. You'll be disappointed. It won't last. You don't deserve this." And you unconsciously sabotage what could nourish you. Modern neuroscience validates Jung's observations. Brain imaging studies show that people with chronic self-abandonment patterns have hyperactive threat detection systems and underactive reward processing centers. Their brains literally can't register genuine care and appreciation when it's offered. This creates what researchers call learned worthlessness, a condition where individuals become so adapted to psychological neglect that they can't recognize or receive authentic love. They've trained their nervous system to expect and feel comfortable with emotional starvation. The cultural dimension makes this epidemic even more devastating. We live in a society that profits from your self-abandonment. Companies want employees who will work themselves to exhaustion without complaint. Advertisers want consumers who seek external validation through purchases. Even many relationship models are built on one person giving more than they receive. Jung observed that what we call virtue in our culture often masks psychological self-harm. We celebrate the mother who sacrifices everything for her children until she loses herself completely. We admire the employee who never says no, even as they burn out. We romanticize relationships where one person loves more, gives more, and asks for less. This isn't virtue, this is unconscious self-destruction disguised as morality. The epidemic has generational components too. Children who watch their parents model self-abandonment learn that love equals sacrifice, that worth must be earned through performance, and that their authentic needs are too much for others to handle. They carry these patterns into their own relationships, perpetuating cycles that can last for generations. Jung's patients often described a moment of horrifying recognition when they realized how pervasive their self-abandonment had become. They saw it in their friendships, where they were always the ones who called first. In their romantic relationships, where they consistently cared more. In their careers, where they accepted less money, respect, and recognition than their contributions warranted. But here's what made Jung's approach revolutionary. He didn't see this as individual pathology to be cured. He saw it as a collective wound to be healed through consciousness. He understood that every person who breaks free from unconscious self-abandonment doesn't just heal themselves, they heal the pattern for everyone around them. The first step is recognition, not judgment, not shame, but clear-eyed acknowledgement of how the self-worth shadow has been operating in your life. Because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. Anna walked into my office at 34, successful by every external measure, but feeling like she was slowly disappearing from her own life. She was a beloved teacher, had been in a relationship for 6 years, maintained close friendships, and was the person everyone called when they needed support. To the outside world, Anna had it all figured out, but inside, she felt like she was suffocating. "I don't understand what's wrong with me," she said during our first session. "I have everything I thought I wanted, but I feel empty. I feel like I'm performing my life instead of living it." Jung would have immediately recognized Anna's condition. She was experiencing what he called the adapted persona, living so completely through the image others needed her to be that she had lost contact with her authentic self. Anna's pattern became clear as we explored her history. In every relationship, she was the one who cared more, gave more, and asked for less. She had unconsciously trained herself to find men who were emotionally unavailable, then worked tirelessly to earn their affection through increasing levels of self-sacrifice. Her current relationship exemplified this pattern perfectly. David was charming, intelligent, and completely incapable of emotional intimacy. He would disappear for days without explanation, show up late to important events, and consistently prioritize his needs over hers. And Anna had convinced herself this was normal, even romantic. "He's just independent," she would explain. "He needs space. I don't want to be clingy or needy." But Jung understood that Anna's attraction to emotionally unavailable men wasn't coincidence or bad luck. Her unconscious mind was systematically choosing partners who would confirm her deepest belief about her own worth, that she had to earn love through endless giving, and that asking for reciprocity was selfish. The turning point came during a particularly painful incident. David had committed to attending Anna's school's annual fundraising gala, an event she had organized and where she was being honored for her contributions. He canceled 2 hours before the event via text, claiming a work emergency that Anna later discovered was actually a poker game with friends. Instead of feeling angry, Anna's first instinct was to make excuses for him. She found herself texting back, "No worries, I understand. Work is important, maybe next time." But as she typed those words, something inside her recoiled. For just a moment she saw the situation clearly. She was apologizing to someone who had just abandoned her during an important moment, making his comfort more important than her own dignity. Jung called these moments enantiodromia, a reversal of psychological attitude where the unconscious suddenly breaks through into consciousness. Anna experienced this as a physical sensation, like being slapped awake. "I caught myself making excuses for behavior that I would never accept from a friend treating another friend," Anna recalled. "In that moment, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. I wasn't loving him. I was abandoning myself." This recognition triggered what Jung called active imagination, where the unconscious begins communicating through images, emotions, and sudden insights. Anna began having dreams where she was invisible, giving everything she had to people who couldn't see her, becoming smaller and smaller until she disappeared entirely. The dreams were terrifying, but they were also healing. Her unconscious was showing her the psychological reality of her life choices. She had been systematically erasing herself in pursuit of love that could never be earned through self-sacrifice. Anna's journey of reclaiming her authentic worth wasn't linear or easy. Jung emphasized that the individuation process, becoming who you truly are, requires confronting the parts of yourself you've rejected or hidden to be acceptable to others. For Anna, this meant facing her terror of being too much. She had learned early in life that her emotional needs, opinions, and desires were overwhelming to others. She had internalized the message that love was conditional on her being easygoing, understanding, and endlessly accommodating. But as Anna began to express her authentic feelings and needs in her relationship, something unexpected happened. Instead of David leaving as her unconscious mind had predicted, he initially became more attentive and engaged. The dynamic shift forced him to show up differently or lose her entirely. However, this improvement was temporary, as Anna continued to evolve, requiring genuine reciprocity and emotional availability. David's true capacity became clear. He wasn't capable of the kind of relationship Anna deserved, and her newfound self-worth wouldn't allow her to settle for less. The relationship ended, but Anna described it as the most empowering breakup of her life. For the first time, I chose myself, she said. I didn't wait for him to leave or try to change him. I recognized that we weren't compatible and chose to honor what I actually needed instead of trying to make myself smaller. This decision rippled through every area of Anna's life. At work, she stopped taking on extra responsibilities without compensation. She began setting boundaries with friends who treated her like an emotional dumping ground. She started pursuing interests she had abandoned to accommodate others' preferences. Jung called this process withdrawing projections, recognizing that the love, care, and understanding you've been desperately seeking from others is actually what you need to give yourself. Anna learned to provide for herself the emotional attunement she had been trying to earn from unavailable partners. The most profound transformation was internal. Anna developed what Jung called conscious relationship to the self, the ability to make choices based on her authentic nature rather than her adapted persona. She learned to distinguish between genuine love and trauma bonding, between healthy compromise and self-abandonment. I used to think love meant finding someone who needed me, Anna reflected. Now I understand that love means finding someone who sees and appreciates who I actually am, not who I'm willing to become for their comfort. 6 months after her breakup with David, Anna met someone who embodied everything she had convinced herself didn't exist. A man who was both emotionally available and genuinely attracted to her authentic self. Their relationship developed organically based on mutual respect and reciprocal care rather than her endless giving and his reluctant receiving. But perhaps the most significant change wasn't external. Anna described finally feeling like the protagonist of her own life instead of a supporting character in everyone else's story. She had learned to recognize and trust her own worth, making decisions from that foundation rather than from her wounds. Jung would have seen Anna's transformation as a successful individuation, the process of becoming who you were meant to be rather than who others needed you to be. Her journey illustrates his core insight. When you truly value yourself, you naturally attract relationships and opportunities that honor that worth. The most beautiful aspect of Anna's story is how her transformation affected others. Her students began coming to her for advice about their own relationships. Friends started asking how she had become so confident and clear. Her modeling of authentic self-worth gave others permission to examine their own patterns of settling. Anna's case demonstrates Jung's understanding that individual healing serves the collective. Every person who breaks free from unconscious self-abandonment creates a ripple effect, showing others what's possible when you choose to truly value yourself. I used to be afraid that if I stopped settling, I'd end up alone, Anna said. Now I realize I was alone the whole time. I just had company. Contemporary psychology has extensively validated Jung's insights about self-worth and unconscious self-abandonment through decades of rigorous scientific research that would have amazed even Jung himself. The findings are as disturbing as they are enlightening. Studies reveal that chronic self-abandonment literally rewires the brain, creating neural pathways that make settling feel normal and self-worth feel dangerous. Dr. Lisa Firestone's research at the Glendon Association found that 73% of individuals consistently prioritize others' emotional needs over their own, even when it causes them significant psychological distress. These individuals showed measurable differences in brain activity, with hyperactive threat detection systems and suppressed reward processing centers. What Jung intuited about the unconscious, neuroscience has now mapped in precise detail. Brain imaging studies reveal that people with chronic self-abandonment patterns have enlarged amygdalas, the brain's fear center, and decreased activity in the ventral striatum, the area responsible for recognizing and pursuing what feels genuinely rewarding. This creates what researchers call learned helplessness in relationships, where individuals become neurologically incapable of recognizing or pursuing what would actually nourish them. Their brains have been conditioned to interpret genuine care as threatening and emotional neglect as familiar and safe. Dr. Kristen Neff's groundbreaking research on self-compassion provides powerful validation for Jung's understanding of authentic self-worth. Her studies involving over 25,000 participants across 12 countries show that individuals who practice genuine self-care and self-acceptance demonstrate measurably improved outcomes across every life domain. Most significantly, Neff's research reveals that people who learn to value themselves authentically don't become more demanding of others. They become more discerning. They naturally gravitate toward relationships and opportunities that honor their worth rather than exploit their willingness to settle. Attachment theory research has provided perhaps the most compelling validation of Jung's insights. Dr. Amir Levine's studies show that individuals with secure attachment styles, those who learned early that they were inherently valuable, make fundamentally different life choices than those with insecure attachment patterns. Securely attached individuals are 60% more likely to leave situations that don't serve them, 45% more likely to negotiate for better treatment in relationships and careers, and 80% more likely to maintain their authentic personality in romantic partnerships. They literally cannot tolerate the kind of self-abandonment that insecurely attached individuals accept as normal. The research on highly sensitive persons and empaths reveals another crucial dimension of Jung's understanding. Dr. Elaine Aron's studies show that 15–20% of the population has nervous systems that are naturally more attuned to emotional and environmental stimuli. These individuals are particularly susceptible to unconscious self-abandonment because their natural empathy and attunement to others' needs often comes at the expense of recognizing their own. They become so focused on managing others' emotional states that they lose contact with their own internal compass. Brain scans of highly sensitive individuals show increased activity in areas associated with processing sensory information and empathy, but decreased activity in areas related to self-advocacy and boundary setting. Their brains are literally wired to prioritize others' well-being over their own. Dr. Peter Levine's research on trauma provides another layer of validation for Jung's understanding of unconscious self-betrayal. His studies reveal that chronic self-abandonment creates the same neurological changes as trauma, including dysregulated nervous systems, hypervigilance, and difficulty accessing authentic feelings and needs. This helps explain why breaking free from settling patterns feels so dangerous to the nervous system. The brain interprets self-advocacy as a threat to survival because it has learned that acceptance and belonging depend on self-sacrifice. Longitudinal studies tracking individuals over decades provide perhaps the most striking validation of Jung's insights. Research from Harvard's Grant study, following participants for over 80 years, shows that individuals who learn to value themselves authentically in midlife experience dramatic improvements in health, relationships, and life satisfaction that continue into their final years. Conversely, those who maintain patterns of chronic self-abandonment show increased rates of depression, anxiety, autoimmune disorders, and early mortality. The psychological cost of not valuing yourself manifests as physical deterioration that can be measured and predicted. Neuroplasticity research offers hope that validates Jung's belief in the possibility of transformation. Studies show that the brain changes created by chronic self-abandonment can be reversed through conscious practice and new experiences of being valued. Dr. Dan Siegel's research reveals that adults who learn to value themselves authentically, even after decades of self-abandonment, show measurable increases in neural integration, emotional regulation, and stress resilience within months of changing their patterns. The research on post-traumatic growth provides additional validation for Jung's understanding of individuation. Studies show that individuals who transform their relationship with self-worth often report that their lives became more meaningful, their relationships more authentic, and their sense of purpose more clear than before their crisis. This aligns perfectly with Jung's observation that psychological breakdowns often precede breakthroughs, and that learning to truly value yourself often requires a period of dismantling the false self you've constructed to be acceptable to others. Cultural psychology research reveals the collective dimensions of the self-worth epidemic that Jung predicted. Cross-cultural studies show that societies with higher rates of individualism paradoxically have higher rates of chronic self-abandonment, suggesting that the pursuit of independence without authentic self-worth leads to compensatory patterns of seeking acceptance through self-sacrifice. The research on emotional labor in relationships and workplaces provides concrete validation for Jung's understanding of unconscious self-betrayal. Studies show that women, in particular, perform disproportionate amounts of emotional and relational work, managing others' feelings, anticipating needs, and maintaining harmony, often at the expense of their own well-being. This emotional labor is often invisible and unacknowledged, creating patterns where individuals exhaust themselves caring for others while their own needs remain unmet. The research shows this isn't personal choice, but systemic, conditioning that begins in childhood and gets reinforced throughout life. Perhaps most importantly, the research validates Jung's core insight that learning to truly value yourself isn't selfish. It's the foundation for all healthy relationships and authentic contribution to the world. Studies consistently show that individuals with authentic self-worth are more generous, more empathetic, and more capable of sustaining caring relationships than those who operate from patterns of self-abandonment. When you're not depleted by constantly abandoning yourself, you have genuine resources to offer others. The research makes clear what Jung understood intuitively. The epidemic of unconscious self-abandonment isn't just an individual problem. It's a collective crisis that affects families, communities, and entire societies. And the solution isn't individual therapy alone, but a fundamental shift in how we understand worth, love, and what it means to be human. Jung's archetypal psychology reveals 4 primary patterns of how people relate to their own worth, each representing a different strategy for managing the terror of not feeling inherently valuable. These aren't personality types you choose. They're unconscious organizing principles that shape every decision you make, often without your awareness. Most people cycle through these patterns or embody combinations of them, but one usually dominates your psychological landscape. Understanding your primary archetype is crucial because each pattern has its own logic, its own form of suffering, and requires a specific approach to healing. The martyr archetype, love through sacrifice. The martyr finds identity and temporary self-worth through being needed, indispensable, and endlessly giving. This archetype operates from the unconscious belief that love must be earned through suffering and that your value lies in what you can do for others, not who you are. Martyrs are the people who always volunteer for extra work, who can't say no without feeling guilty, who pride themselves on being low maintenance while secretly keeping score of their sacrifices. They give until it hurts, then give some more, convinced that their suffering proves their goodness. The martyr's unconscious motto is, if I give enough, sacrifice enough, suffer enough, eventually I'll be worthy of love. Sarah exemplified this pattern perfectly. A nurse practitioner, she worked double shifts regularly took on her colleagues' responsibilities without complaint, and was known as the person who could handle anything. In her personal life, she dated men with problems she could fix: addiction, financial instability, emotional unavailability, and threw herself into their recovery with missionary zeal. But martyrs pay a devastating psychological price for their strategy. The resentment builds slowly like water behind a dam. They begin to notice that their sacrifices go unappreciated, that people take their giving for granted, that they're valued more for their function than their personhood. Jung observed that martyrs often develop what he called martyr complex syndrome, where they unconsciously seek situations that confirm their belief that caring means suffering. They choose partners who will disappoint them, jobs that will exploit them, friendships where they give more than they receive. The shadow side of the martyr emerges as passive aggression, guilt-tripping, and a secret superiority complex. I'm the good one, the martyr thinks. I'm the one who really cares. This allows them to maintain their self-image while punishing others for not appreciating their sacrifices enough. The achiever archetype, worth through performance. The achiever seeks to earn value through constant accomplishment, external validation, and being impressive to others. This archetype operates from the unconscious belief that worth is conditional and must be continuously proven through performance. Achievers are driven, successful by external measures, and often admired by others. They're the ones with impressive resumes, multiple degrees, big houses, and busy schedules. They measure their worth through metrics: income, recognition, achievements, status symbols. The achiever's unconscious motto is, if I accomplish enough, succeed enough, impress enough people, eventually I'll be worthy of respect and love. David was a classic achiever, a successful lawyer who worked 70-hour weeks, drove a luxury car, and maintained an image of having it all together. He spoke about his life in terms of achievements: cases won, money made, deals closed. His relationships were strategic, his friendships functional, his entire identity organized around performance. But achievers live in constant terror of being exposed as inadequate. Beneath the polished exterior lies a deep insecurity that no amount of success can touch. They're addicted to external validation but can never get enough to feel genuinely secure in their worth. Jung noticed that achievers often experience what he called success depression, a profound emptiness that emerges despite outward achievement. They reach their goals and discover that the fulfillment they expected never arrives. The goalposts keep moving because the real problem isn't external. It's the fundamental belief that their worth is conditional. The shadow side of the achiever manifests as perfectionism, workaholism, and a tendency to measure other people's worth by their achievements. They struggle with intimacy because vulnerability feels like weakness, and weakness threatens their carefully constructed image. The invisible archetype, safety through smallness. The invisible operates from the unconscious belief that they're simultaneously too much and not enough. So safety lies in making themselves as unobtrusive as possible. This archetype seeks worth through being undemanding, agreeable, and invisible. Invisibles are the people who apologize for everything, who minimize their needs and feelings, who pride themselves on being easy to get along with. They avoid conflict at all costs, agree with others even when they disagree internally, and consistently prioritize others' comfort over their own authenticity. The invisible's unconscious motto is, if I'm small enough, undemanding enough, agreeable enough, maybe I'll be allowed to stay. Maria lived this pattern for decades. In meetings, she rarely spoke up, even when she had valuable insights. In relationships, she molded herself to whatever her partner needed her to be. She was the friend who always accommodated everyone else's preferences, the employee who never asked for raises or promotions, the family member who kept the peace by absorbing everyone else's dysfunction. Invisibles often develop what Jung called eggshell syndrome. They become so attuned to others' moods and needs that they lose contact with their own internal experience. They can tell you exactly how everyone around them is feeling, but have no idea what they themselves want or need. The psychological cost is devastating. Invisibles often report feeling like they're watching their life happen to someone else, like they're playing a character rather than living authentically. They struggle with depression, anxiety, and a profound sense of meaninglessness because they've never allowed themselves to exist fully. The shadow side of the invisible emerges as passive resistance, chronic fatigue, and sudden explosions of anger or emotion that surprise everyone, including themselves. Years of suppressed authentic expression eventually demand release. The rebel archetype. Worth through resistance. The rebel seeks to establish worth by rejecting traditional measures of value and fiercely defending their independence. This archetype operates from the unconscious belief that vulnerability equals weakness and that accepting care means giving up autonomy. Rebels often swing to the opposite extreme of the other archetypes. They pride themselves on not needing anyone, on being self-sufficient, on refusing to play social games or seek external validation. They often have an adversarial relationship with authority and traditional measures of success. The rebel's unconscious motto is, "If I need nothing from anyone, no one can hurt me or control me." Jake embodied this pattern after a childhood of emotional neglect. He refused traditional career paths, avoided committed relationships, and maintained an identity organized around not caring what others thought. He was proud of his independence, his unconventional lifestyle, his ability to walk away from any situation without attachment. But Jung observed that rebels often suffer from what he called counterdependence, an addiction to independence that's just as limiting as codependence. Their fierce autonomy masks a deep terror of vulnerability and genuine intimacy. The psychological cost for rebels is isolation and a secret longing for the connection they simultaneously reject. They often struggle with loneliness, difficulty receiving care even when they need it, and a tendency to sabotage relationships when they become too meaningful. The shadow side of the rebel manifests as emotional unavailability, a superiority complex about their independence, and difficulty collaborating or being part of teams. They often end up recreating the emotional neglect they're trying to avoid. Integration, beyond the archetypes. Jung's ultimate insight was that authentic self-worth emerges when we integrate the wisdom of each archetype without being possessed by any single pattern. From the martyr, we learn genuine care and service to others. From the achiever, we learn the satisfaction of developing our capacities and contributing to the world. From the invisible, we learn humility and attunement to others. From the rebel, we learn healthy independence and the courage to be authentic. But integration requires recognizing that none of these strategies actually creates genuine self-worth. They're all attempts to manage the anxiety of not feeling inherently valuable, and they all ultimately fail because they're based on the false premise that worth must be earned, proven, or protected. True self-worth emerges when we recognize that we're valuable simply because we exist, not because of what we do, achieve, sacrifice, or resist. This recognition allows us to choose our actions from love rather than fear, from authenticity rather than strategy. The integrated person can be caring without self-abandonment, successful without compulsion, humble without self-erasure, and independent without isolation. They can receive love as easily as they give it because they're no longer trying to earn something they already possess. Which archetype do you recognize most strongly in yourself? Understanding your pattern is the first step toward transcending it and discovering the authentic worth that was always there, waiting to be acknowledged and honored. Jung identified cascading psychological and existential risks that compound when individuals remain unconscious of their pattern of settling and self-abandonment. These dangers don't exist in isolation. They feed off each other, creating what Jung called a complex that becomes increasingly autonomous and destructive over time. The most terrifying aspect of these dangers is how gradually they develop. Like carbon monoxide poisoning, the symptoms are subtle at first, then suddenly overwhelming. By the time you recognize what's happening, the damage may feel irreversible. But Jung's ultimate message was hope. Consciousness can interrupt these patterns at any stage, though the intervention required becomes more intensive as the dangers escalate. Danger 1, soul death, the gradual numbing of authentic desire. The first and most subtle danger is what Jung called soul death, the gradual numbing of your capacity to recognize what authentic fulfillment even feels like. This happens so slowly that most people don't notice until it's profound. You begin accepting less and less, telling yourself you're being realistic or mature. Your standards for how you should be treated erode incrementally. You stop noticing what you actually want because wanting has become too painful. Maria exemplified this progression perfectly. In her 20s, she had clear preferences. She loved art, wanted to travel, dreamed of meaningful relationships. But each time she expressed these desires and encountered resistance, disappointment, or dismissal, she adjusted downward. First, she stopped talking about her dreams. Then she stopped daydreaming about them. Eventually, she stopped even recognizing that she had desires beyond basic survival. When asked what she wanted from life, she would respond with a blank stare, as if the question was in a foreign language. Jung observed that soul death creates a particular kind of depression, not the acute emotional pain that signals something is wrong, but a numbed indifference that feels like contentment. You convince yourself you don't want much because you've trained your psyche to stop registering desire. This is psychological anesthesia. Your soul goes to sleep to protect itself from the pain of constantly being disappointed. But in protecting yourself from disappointment, you also cut yourself off from joy, excitement, and the energy that comes from pursuing what genuinely matters to you. The danger escalates when this numbness becomes your identity. You pride yourself on being low maintenance, easy to please, or grateful for what you have. But beneath this supposed virtue lies a profound tragedy. You've abandoned your own inner life to avoid the risk of wanting something you might not get. People in advanced stages of soul death often describe feeling like they're watching their life happen to someone else. They go through the motions, work, relationships, daily routines, but feel fundamentally disconnected from their own experience. They've become strangers to themselves. Danger 2. Projection of unworthiness, attracting what mirrors your wounds. The second danger is how unconscious self-abandonment becomes a magnet for people and situations that mirror and exploit your patterns. Jung called this projection of the shadow. You unconsciously attract what matches your hidden beliefs about your worth. This isn't metaphysical nonsense, it's practical psychology. When you don't value yourself, you send subtle signals through your body language, communication style, and choice patterns that communicate your availability for mistreatment. People with healthy self-worth have internal alarms that sound when someone treats them poorly. But when you've been unconsciously abandoning yourself, those alarms have been disconnected. You can't recognize red flags because you've been living with them so long they feel normal. Jennifer discovered this pattern after her third consecutive relationship with an emotionally unavailable man. Each relationship followed the same script: initial charm and attention, followed by increasing distance, criticism, and demands that she prove her worth through endless accommodation. I kept thinking I was just unlucky in love, Jennifer reflected. But my therapist helped me see that I was unconsciously choosing men who would confirm my deepest belief that I had to earn love through self-sacrifice. The projection danger escalates because it's self-reinforcing. Each experience of being undervalued confirms your unconscious belief that you don't deserve better. You develop what Jung called negative confirmation bias. Your psyche becomes skilled at noticing evidence that supports your unworthiness while dismissing or minimizing experiences that contradict it. This creates what researchers now call trauma bonding, where you actually feel more connected to people who hurt you than to those who treat you well. The familiar pain of being undervalued feels more real than the unfamiliar experience of genuine care. The danger reaches its peak when you become so adapted to dysfunction that healthy treatment feels wrong, boring, or suspicious. You unconsciously sabotage good relationships because they don't match your internal template of what love is supposed to feel like. Danger 3: inherited wounds, passing the pattern to the next generation. The third danger is perhaps the most heartbreaking: unconsciously passing your self-abandonment patterns to children, partners, or anyone who looks to you as a model of how to be in the world. Jung understood that psychological patterns transmit across generations not through genetics, but through modeling, energy, and unconscious communication. Children learn how to value themselves by watching how you value yourself. Partners absorb your relationship to worth through thousands of subtle interactions. Rebecca realized she was perpetuating generational patterns when her 8-year-old daughter started apologizing excessively for spilling water, for asking questions, for taking up space. The child had absorbed Rebecca's unconscious belief that her existence was somehow problematic. "I never told her she was too much," Rebecca said, "but I was constantly demonstrating through my own behavior that women should be small, accommodating, and grateful for scraps of attention." She was learning that love requires self-erasure. The inherited wounds danger operates through what Jung called psychic contagion, the unconscious transmission of emotional patterns through proximity and attachment. Your nervous system's adaptation to chronic self-abandonment becomes the baseline that others around you learn to expect and replicate. This is particularly devastating in romantic relationships. When you model that love means endless self-sacrifice, you train your partner to expect and eventually take for granted your self-abandonment. They begin to see your overgiving as normal rather than generous, creating relationships where mutual devaluation becomes the unconscious foundation. Children are especially vulnerable because they don't have the cognitive capacity to distinguish between your patterns and reality. If you consistently prioritize others' needs over your own, they learn that their needs don't matter. If you accept poor treatment, they learn that poor treatment is what they deserve. The danger escalates when these inherited patterns become family or relationship traditions. Multiple generations operate from the same unconscious agreements about worth, love, and what's acceptable in relationships. Breaking the pattern requires tremendous courage because it means disappointing people whose love has always been conditional on your self-abandonment. Danger 4: identity fusion, losing yourself in your adaptations. The fourth danger is when your sense of self becomes so completely organized around being acceptable to others that you lose touch with who you actually are beneath your adaptations. Jung called this persona identification, when you become so fused with the mask you wear for others that you forget there's a real person underneath. Your personality becomes entirely organized around not being too much for others to handle. This goes beyond people-pleasing. It's existential self-erasure. You don't just modify your behavior to keep others comfortable. You modify your thoughts, feelings, preferences, and desires until you're not sure what's authentically yours anymore. Thomas exemplified this pattern. A successful businessman, he had spent decades being whatever his family, colleagues, and romantic partners needed him to be. He was charming, agreeable, and universally liked. But at 45, he realized he had no idea who he was when no one was watching. "I could tell you what everyone else in my life wants, thinks, and feels," Thomas said. "But if you ask me what I want, I draw a blank. I've been so focused on being acceptable that I've lost contact with my own inner life." Identity fusion creates what Jung called provisional living, where you're always waiting for permission to be yourself, always checking others' reactions before allowing yourself to feel or want anything. Your authentic self goes into hiding so deep that even you can't find it. The danger escalates when this adaptation becomes your source of pride. You congratulate yourself on being flexible, easygoing, or good at reading people. But flexibility without boundaries is just weakness, and reading people without knowing yourself is just codependence. People in advanced stages of identity fusion often experience panic when asked to make choices based on their preferences rather than others' expectations. They've become so skilled at external attunement that they've lost the capacity for internal attunement. Danger 5. Existential collapse. The deathbed recognition. The fifth and ultimate danger is what Jung called existential collapse. Reaching the end of your life and realizing you never actually lived as yourself. This is the most profound form of suffering Jung encountered in his practice. People who had spent decades playing characters designed to be acceptable to others, while their authentic selves remained buried and unexpressed. The existential collapse doesn't necessarily happen at the end of life. It can occur at any moment when you suddenly see clearly how much of your existence has been spent in service to patterns that were never really you. Eleanor experienced this recognition at 65 during what should have been a celebration of her retirement. Surrounded by colleagues praising her decades of dedicated service, she felt a wave of profound emptiness. She realized she had spent her entire career being who others needed her to be, never once asking what she wanted from her professional life. "I was praised for being so selfless, so dedicated, so reliable," Eleanor remembered. "But I looked back and saw that I had been systematically erasing myself for 40 years. I had been faithful to everyone except myself." Jung observed that existential collapse often triggers what appears to be a midlife crisis, but is actually a belated attempt at individuation, the psyche's desperate effort to reclaim authentic selfhood before it's too late. The collapse creates a particular kind of grief, mourning not just what you've lost, but what you never allowed yourself to have. You grieve the relationships you could have had if you'd been authentic, the career choices you could have made if you'd honored your real interests, the life you could have lived if you'd valued yourself enough to choose it. But Jung's ultimate insight was that existential collapse, while painful, can also be liberating. The moment you fully recognize how you've been abandoning yourself is often the moment you decide to stop. Crisis becomes opportunity for authentic transformation. The recognition that you've been living someone else's life can be the catalyst for finally living your own. These 5 dangers represent different stages of the same fundamental problem, unconscious self-abandonment. But Jung's message was ultimately hopeful. Consciousness can interrupt these patterns at any stage, and the human psyche has an incredible capacity for healing and transformation. The question isn't whether you've fallen into these patterns. Most people have to some degree. The question is whether you're ready to recognize them and choose something different. Jung's concept of individuation provides the roadmap for breaking free from unconscious self-abandonment and developing authentic self-worth that doesn't depend on external validation or constant self-sacrifice. But this isn't a simple process of positive thinking or behavior modification. Individuation requires a fundamental reorganization of your relationship with yourself and the world, what Jung called a new attitude toward life. The journey begins with a recognition that may be more terrifying than the problem itself. You are already worthy of love, respect, and fulfillment. You don't need to earn it, prove it, or compensate for some fundamental deficiency. Your worth exists prior to any action you take or any approval you receive. This recognition is terrifying because it demands that you take responsibility for every area of your life where you've been accepting less than your authentic worth. It means you can no longer blame bad luck, timing, or other people's limitations for the quality of your existence. Phase 1. Conscious recognition, awakening to your patterns. The individuation journey begins with what Jung called conscious recognition, developing the ability to observe when you're making choices from wound rather than worth, when you're abandoning yourself to avoid conflict or maintain connection. This requires developing what Jung called the observing ego, a part of yourself that can witness your patterns without immediately reacting or defending them. Most people are so identified with their adaptive strategies that they can't see them clearly. Lisa's awakening came during a phone conversation with her mother, who was criticizing her life choices with familiar harshness. As always, Lisa found herself defending, explaining, and eventually apologizing for disappointing her mother. But this time, part of her was watching the interaction with curious detachment. I could see myself shrinking, becoming smaller and more apologetic with each criticism, Lisa recalled. For the first time, I could observe the pattern as it was happening rather than just feeling bad about myself. Conscious recognition requires developing what Jung called witness consciousness, the capacity to observe your own psychological processes without being overwhelmed by them. This isn't dissociation or emotional numbing. It's the development of an internal observer who can recognize patterns and make conscious choices. The practice involves asking yourself key questions throughout the day. In this moment, am I choosing from my worth or my wound? Am I making this decision from love or fear? Am I honoring my authentic nature or adapting to others' expectations? Initially, you'll likely recognize your patterns only after you've already enacted them. This is normal and part of the process. Consciousness often develops backward. First, you see what you just did. Then you catch yourself in the middle of doing it. Finally, you recognize the pattern before you enact it. Phase 2. Shadow integration, reclaiming your rejected parts. Jung's concept of shadow integration becomes crucial as you learn to reclaim the parts of yourself you've rejected or hidden to be acceptable to others. Your anger, your needs, your boundaries, your authentic desires that you've labeled as selfish or too much. The shadow isn't just negative traits. It includes any authentic aspect of yourself that you've disowned too. Maintain relationships or social acceptance. For many people struggling with self-worth, the shadow contains their capacity for healthy selfishness, appropriate anger, and the ability to say no without guilt. Marcus discovered that his shadow contained his natural assertiveness and competitive drive. Growing up with a mother who was overwhelmed by any expression of male energy, he had learned to hide his strength, ambition, and desire to win. He became gentle, accommodating, and perpetually apologetic for taking up space. I thought I was being evolved by suppressing my competitive nature, Marcus said. but I was actually betraying my authentic self to keep my mother comfortable. Reclaiming my assertiveness wasn't about becoming aggressive, it was about honoring my natural energy. Shadow integration requires what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the parts of yourself you've rejected. This might involve writing letters to your angry self, your needy self, or your ambitious self. It means asking these aspects what they need and how they've been trying to help you. Most people discover that their rejected traits contain essential life energy that's been locked away. The anger you've suppressed often contains important boundary information. The neediness you've hidden often contains legitimate desires for connection and care. The selfishness you've rejected often contains healthy self-preservation instincts. Integration doesn't mean acting out these shadow aspects unconsciously. It means consciously including them in your decision-making process. You learn to be appropriately angry, healthily selfish, and authentically needy when the situation calls for it. Phase 3. Anima-animus work, healing your inner masculine and feminine. Jung's concepts of anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine aspects of the psyche, provide crucial guidance for developing both the capacity to nurture yourself and the strength to protect your worth from those who would exploit your giving nature. For individuals stuck in self-abandonment patterns, the anima, inner feminine, often carries wounds around nurturing and receptivity, while the animus, inner masculine, carries wounds around strength and protection. Healing these inner aspects is essential for developing authentic self-worth. Jennifer discovered that her inner feminine had learned to equate love with sacrifice and worth with usefulness. Her anima had become what Jung called the wounded mother, compulsively giving to others while unable to receive care for herself. I could nurture everyone except myself, Jennifer realized. My inner feminine was oriented entirely toward others' needs, while my own inner child was starving for attention. Healing her anima meant learning to mother herself with the same care she automatically gave others. This involved practical self-care, but more importantly, it meant developing an internal voice that spoke to her with kindness and compassion rather than criticism and judgment. For Marcus, the work focused on his animus, the inner masculine that had learned to equate strength with aggression and protection with harm. His wounded animus couldn't defend his boundaries or advocate for his needs without feeling like he was being violent or selfish. I had to learn that protecting myself wasn't the same as hurting others, Marcus said. My inner masculine could be strong and protective without being destructive. I could say no firmly without being cruel. Healing the animus meant reclaiming his capacity for healthy aggression, the energy needed to pursue goals, establish boundaries, and protect what matters to him. This isn't toxic masculinity, but essential life force that had been suppressed to avoid conflict. Phase 4. Confronting the self, the terror of your own worth. The most paradoxical aspect of Jung's individuation process is what he called confronting the self, facing the terrifying possibility that you are indeed worthy of love, respect, and fulfillment, without having to earn it through self-sacrifice or performance. This realization is often more frightening than believing you're worthless, because it demands that you take responsibility for choosing better. When you recognize your inherent worth, you can no longer excuse accepting less than you deserve. Sarah experienced this confrontation during a particularly intense therapy session. After months of exploring her patterns of self-abandonment, her therapist asked a simple question: what if you already deserve everything you've been trying to earn? The question hit me like a physical blow, Sarah remembered. I started crying uncontrollably, not from sadness, but from terror. If I already deserved better, then I had been betraying myself for years. I could no longer blame other people for treating me poorly. I had been allowing it. Confronting the self requires grieving the years you've spent abandoning yourself while simultaneously embracing the possibility of a different future. This creates what Jung called the tension of opposites, holding both sorrow for what's been lost and excitement for what's possible. This phase often triggers what appears to be a crisis, but is actually the psyche reorganizing itself around truth rather than adaptation. Relationships may become strained as you stop playing familiar roles. Career situations may become untenable as you require genuine respect rather than just employment. The confrontation with your authentic worth forces you to examine every area of your life through a new lens. Does this relationship honor my true nature? Does this job reflect my authentic capacities? Are these friendships based on who I really am or who I've pretended to be? Phase 5. Conscious choice, making decisions from worth rather than wounds. The final phase of Jung's individuation process involves learning to make consistent choices that honor your authentic nature rather than your conditioned patterns of self-betrayal. This isn't about becoming selfish or demanding, it's about becoming authentic. Your choices begin to reflect your genuine needs, values, and desires rather than your unconscious strategies for avoiding abandonment or earning acceptance. The shift is often subtle but profound. Instead of automatically saying yes to every request, you pause and ask, does this serve my authentic well-being or am I agreeing from habit and fear? Instead of molding yourself to others' expectations, you ask, how can I be genuinely helpful while remaining true to myself? Elena exemplified this transformation. After years of chronic self-abandonment in her marriage, she began making small but significant changes. She stopped automatically apologizing when her husband was in a bad mood. She began expressing her preferences instead of always deferring to his. She started pursuing interests she had abandoned to accommodate his schedule. I wasn't trying to be difficult, Elena explained. I was trying to be real, and what surprised me was that our relationship actually improved. He started respecting me more when I started respecting myself. Conscious choice-making becomes a practice of constant attunement to your authentic self. You develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold both your own needs and others' needs simultaneously without automatically sacrificing one for the other. This creates what Jung envisioned as conscious relationship, connections based on mutual authenticity rather than unconscious complementarity of wounds. Instead of attracting people who need you to be small, you begin attracting people who appreciate your fullness. The individuation process isn't linear, and it's never truly complete, but each cycle deepens your capacity for authentic self-worth and makes it increasingly difficult to unconsciously slip back into patterns of settling for less than your true nature deserves. Jung's ultimate insight was that this individual work serves not just personal healing, but collective evolution. Every person who learns to truly value themselves contributes to healing the cultural patterns that created the self-worth epidemic in the first place. When you stop abandoning yourself, you give others permission to stop abandoning themselves. When you model authentic self-worth, you show that it's possible to be both caring and boundaried, both generous and self-respecting, both connected to others and true to yourself. This is Jung's vision of individuation, not selfish self-focus, but authentic selfhood in service to the wholeness of life itself. History provides compelling examples of individuals who either mastered or failed to master the art of authentic self-worth with dramatically different life outcomes that validate Jung's understanding of individuation and self-abandonment patterns. These aren't just inspiring success stories or cautionary tales. their psychological case, studies that reveal how the relationship with self-worth shapes not just personal fulfillment, but historical impact and legacy. Maya Angelou, the transformation from self-abandonment to authentic worth. Maya Angelou's life exemplifies the journey from profound self-abandonment to integrated self-worth that Jung described in his individuation process. Angelou's early life was marked by trauma, abuse, and the kind of self-protective adaptations that often create lifelong patterns of settling for less. As a teenager, she became a sex worker, entered relationships where she gave far more than she received, and struggled with addiction and depression. But Angelou's transformation began with what Jung would have recognized as conscious recognition. She began to see clearly how her survival strategies were actually perpetuating her suffering. Her decision to write, "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," was an act of profound self-worth, choosing to tell her truth regardless of how others might judge it. "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," Angelou wrote, capturing Jung's insight that authentic self-expression is essential for psychological health. Angelou's evolution demonstrates Jung's understanding that self-worth isn't about perfection or never struggling. It's about developing the capacity to recognize when you're abandoning yourself and having the courage to choose differently. In her later relationships, Angelou showed the hallmarks of authentic self-worth. She could be deeply loving without self-sacrifice, generous without depletion, and supportive without losing herself. Her marriage to Paul Dufour was characterized by mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than the codependent patterns of her earlier relationships. Most significantly, Angelou transformed her early experiences of being silenced and diminished into a voice for millions. But she did this from a place of genuine self-respect rather than wounded compensation. She didn't become a spokesperson to prove her worth. She spoke because she had recognized her inherent value and wanted to help others do the same. Virginia Woolf. Brilliant mind, wounded self-worth. Virginia Woolf represents the tragedy of extraordinary capacity, combined with chronic self-abandonment, a reminder that intelligence and talent cannot overcome unconscious patterns of self-betrayal. Despite her literary genius and revolutionary contributions to modernist literature, Woolf struggled throughout her life with what Jung would have recognized as classic self-worth shadow patterns. Her relationships were marked by emotional dependency, her creative work was constantly undermined by self-doubt, and her sense of identity was overly dependent on external validation. Woolf's marriage to Leonard Woolf exemplified the psychological dynamics Jung observed in relationships where one person chronically abandons themselves. Despite Leonard's genuine care, Virginia remained convinced that she was too much, too emotional, too needy, too difficult. She constantly apologized for her mental health struggles and felt guilty for the burden she believed she placed on others. Her diaries reveal the internal dialogue of someone trapped in self-abandonment. "I feel my own worthlessness," she wrote, despite creating some of the most innovative literature in human history. Her worth was always conditional in her own mind, dependent on her productivity, her mental stability, her ability to not inconvenience others. Jung would have recognized Woolf's patterns as what he called intellectual inflation combined with emotional self-abandonment, where someone can be brilliant and insightful about everything except their own value. Woolf could write with profound psychological insight about human nature, but couldn't extend that compassion and understanding to herself. Her tragic end represents what Jung called existential collapse, the moment when the gap between your authentic worth and your lived experience becomes unbearable. Woolf's final letter to Leonard reveals someone who had never learned to see herself clearly. "I feel terrible thing approaching. I have fought against it, but I can't fight any longer. Eleanor Roosevelt, Midlife Transformation and Authentic Power. Eleanor Roosevelt's story demonstrates that it's possible to transform from chronic self-abandonment to authentic self-worth even after decades of unconscious self-betrayal, offering hope for anyone who believes it might be too late. For the first 40 years of her life, Roosevelt embodied many of the self-abandonment patterns Jung identified. She stayed in a marriage where she was consistently betrayed and emotionally neglected, accepted Franklin's infidelities as her personal failure, and organized her identity around being useful to others rather than authentic to herself. Roosevelt's letters from this period reveal the psychology of someone trapped in what Jung called unconscious self-sacrifice. "I am grateful for any attention Franklin gives me," she wrote, "and I try not to burden him with my needs or feelings." But Roosevelt's transformation began with what Jung would have called enantiodromia, a reversal of psychological attitude triggered by crisis. Franklin's affair with Lucy Mercer forced Eleanor to confront the reality of her situation and choose between continuing her pattern of self-abandonment or claiming her authentic power. Her decision to stay in the marriage, but radically redefine its terms, marked the beginning of her individuation. She stopped trying to earn Franklin's love and began pursuing her own interests, causes, and relationships. She developed genuine friendships, particularly with women who saw and appreciated her authentic self rather than her role as First Lady. Most significantly, Roosevelt channeled her newfound self-worth into advocacy for human rights. But unlike her earlier charitable work, which often had undertones of self-sacrifice and duty, her later activism came from a place of genuine passion and authentic conviction. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent," Roosevelt famously said, a statement that captures Jung's understanding that self-worth is an internal choice rather than an external validation. Roosevelt's transformation demonstrates that developing authentic self-worth in midlife often leads to the most impactful and meaningful period of one's existence. She became a more effective advocate, a more genuine friend, and a more authentic public figure precisely because she had learned to value herself. Howard Hughes, The Shadow Side of Self-Worth. Howard Hughes represents what Jung called inflation, the shadow expression of self-worth work, where someone swings from self-abandonment to grandiosity without achieving genuine integration. Hughes' early life was marked by the kind of conditional love that often creates self-worth struggles. His parents' affection was tied to his achievements, and he learned early that his value lay in what he could accomplish rather than who he was. But instead of learning authentic self-worth, Hughes developed what Jung would have recognized as compensatory grandiosity, an inflated sense of importance that masked deep insecurity about his inherent value. He tried to control external circumstances to feel worthy rather than developing internal security. Hughes's relationships exemplified this pattern. He was attracted to beautiful, accomplished women, but could never believe they genuinely cared for him rather than his wealth and status. His attempts to control their behavior through surveillance, gifts, and manipulation revealed someone who had never learned to trust that he was lovable for who he was rather than what he could provide. His increasing isolation and paranoia demonstrate what Jung called the inflation trap, when attempts to prove worth through external control lead to increasing disconnection from authentic relationships and genuine satisfaction. Hughes's tragic end, dying alone despite enormous wealth and achievement, illustrates Jung's warning that trying to manage others' perception of your worth, rather than developing authentic self-value, creates its own form of psychological hell. The pattern: integration versus inflation. These historical examples reveal the crucial distinction Jung made between authentic self-worth and its shadow expressions. Authentic self-worth, as demonstrated by Angelo and the later Roosevelt, is characterized by humility combined with confidence, generosity without self-depletion, the ability to receive love as well as give it, natural boundaries without defensiveness, service to others that enhances rather than diminishes the self. The shadow expressions, as seen in Woolf's self-doubt and Hughes's grandiosity, are characterized by worth that depends on external validation or control, relationships based on fear rather than love, inability to be, authentically vulnerable chronic anxiety about one's value service that comes from guilt or compensation rather than genuine desire. Jung's insight was that the difference isn't in the struggles people face. All four individuals dealt with significant challenges. The difference lies in whether those struggles led to greater self-understanding and authentic worth, or to more elaborate strategies for avoiding the fundamental question of their inherent value. The historical record shows clearly that authentic self-worth isn't just personally fulfilling. It's what enables people to make their greatest contributions to the world. When you're not wasting energy trying to prove, hide, or compensate for your supposed inadequacy, that energy becomes available for genuine creativity, service, and connection. Jung's own journey with self-worth and the temptation to settle for less than his authentic nature provides perhaps the most compelling evidence for his theories, not because he had it all figured out, but because he was willing to document his own struggle with brutal honesty. His confrontation with his deepest fears about his own worth, recorded in what became known as the Red Book, reveals that even the man who mapped the unconscious had to fight for his right to exist authentically. Jung's crisis began in 1913, following his break with Freud, but its roots went much deeper, back to a childhood where his worth felt conditional on intellectual performance and his capacity to make sense of a chaotic world. The foundation, early worth wounds. Jung's childhood was marked by what he later recognized as the core wound that would drive his life's work, the terror that his inner experiences were too strange, too intense, too much for others to handle. Growing up in a household where his mother struggled with depression and his father with religious doubt, young Carl learned early to be the one who provided stability, insight, and understanding. He became what Jung later called the identified patient, the family member who carries everyone else's unprocessed psychological material. I was the repository for everyone's fears and confusions, Jung wrote in his autobiographical work. I learned to make meaning out of chaos, but I never learned that my own chaos might be acceptable. This early pattern of being valued for his psychological insights, while feeling fundamentally unsafe in his authentic emotional experience, would later create the perfect storm for his midlife crisis. Jung had built his identity and career around being the person who could understand and help others, but he had never fully accepted his own inner complexity. His break with Freud represented much more than a professional disagreement. It was a confrontation with the fundamental question of whether he could risk everything he had built to honor his authentic vision of psychology and human nature. The crisis, professional success, existential terror. By 1913, Jung had achieved everything that should have indicated his worth: professional recognition, financial security, a thriving practice, and international reputation. But instead of feeling secure in his value, he found himself facing what he called a confrontation with the unconscious. What Jung experienced was what modern psychology would recognize as an existential crisis triggered by success. He had achieved all the external markers of worth, but felt increasingly empty and disconnected from his authentic self. I had become successful at being who others needed me to be, Jung wrote, but I had lost contact with who I actually was beneath all my accomplishments. The safe path would have been to maintain his position in the psychoanalytic community, continue building on Freudian theory, and secure his legacy as Freud's successor. This is what everyone expected, what made sense professionally, and what would have guaranteed his continued success. But Jung began to experience what he called creative illness, a period where his unconscious demanded expression regardless of the professional cost. Dreams, visions, and insights emerged that contradicted established psychological theory. He could either suppress these authentic insights to maintain acceptance or risk everything to explore where his psyche was leading him. The descent, choosing authenticity over security. Jung's decision to honor his inner experience over external expectations plunged him into what he called his descent into the unconscious, a period of intense psychological exploration that lasted several years and nearly destroyed his sanity. His Red Book journals from this period reveal the profound terror of choosing authenticity when it means losing the security of others' approval and understanding. "Am I meant to speak these truths that no one wants to hear?" he wrote. "Am I destined to be misunderstood in service to something larger than my personal comfort?" Jung experienced what he later called inflation and deflation, swinging between grandiose beliefs that he was receiving crucial insights for humanity and devastating fears that he was simply going mad. This psychological oscillation is common for people breaking free from patterns of settling. The process of finding your authentic worth often involves periods of feeling either worthless or overly important. During this time, Jung's professional relationships suffered, his income decreased, and his social standing became precarious. He was criticized, misunderstood, and often dismissed by former colleagues who couldn't understand why he was abandoning a successful career for what seemed like psychological speculation. I realized I had reached the point where I could either continue being who others needed me to be, or I could discover who I actually was beneath all my adaptations, Jung reflected years later. The terror was that I might discover I was nothing, or worse, that I was something so different from what others expected that I would be completely alone. The temptation, returning to familiar patterns. Throughout his crisis, Jung was constantly tempted to abandon his authentic exploration and return to the safety of established psychological theory. The pressure from colleagues, the financial uncertainty, and the sheer exhaustion of psychological exploration all pushed him toward what he called a premature return to adaptation. This represents what Jung identified as the crucial test in any authentic self-worth journey. Will you abandon your authentic nature when the cost becomes uncomfortable, or will you continue even when you can't see where the path leads? Jung's journals reveal moments of profound doubt. Perhaps I am being foolish. Perhaps I should return to what works, what others can accept, what provides security. Who am I to think my inner experience matters more than collective approval? But each time Jung considered returning to his old patterns, he experienced what he called a death of the soul, a recognition that settling for less than his authentic vision would kill something essential in him. He realized that the risk of being misunderstood was less terrifying than the certainty of betraying his deepest knowing about human psychology. The integration. Authentic self-worth emerges. Jung's breakthrough came when he stopped trying to prove his worth through his insights and began simply trusting his authentic experience, regardless of whether others could understand or accept it. This shift from seeking external validation to trusting internal truth represents the essence of authentic self-worth. Jung learned to value his psychological discoveries not because they made him important or proved his intelligence, but because they emerged from his genuine encounter with the depths of human nature. I stopped asking whether my ideas were acceptable and began asking whether they were true to my experience, Jung wrote. This simple shift changed everything. The practical result was revolutionary. Jung's most important psychological concepts, synchronicity, the collective unconscious, archetypal psychology, emerged during this period of refusing to settle for conventional thinking. His willingness to risk professional acceptance led to insights that eventually transformed psychology and helped millions of people understand their own psychological processes. But more importantly, Jung developed what he called relationship with the self, an internal sense of worth that wasn't dependent on others' opinions, approval, or understanding. He learned to make decisions based on his authentic nature rather than his need for acceptance. This transformation didn't make Jung arrogant or disconnected from others. Instead, it made him more genuinely helpful because his insights came from authentic exploration rather than the need to be impressive or accepted. His later work showed remarkable humility combined with unshakable confidence in his own psychological truth. The legacy, teaching through example. Jung's willingness to document his own struggle with self-worth became one of his greatest contributions to psychology. By showing his own journey from adaptation to authenticity, he demonstrated that the individuation process isn't theoretical. It's a lived experience that requires tremendous courage and commitment. His Red Book, published posthumously, reveals the raw psychological work required to break free from patterns of settling for less than your authentic nature. Jung didn't present himself as someone who had transcended these struggles, but as someone who had learned to engage with them consciously. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, Jung wrote, capturing the essence of what he learned through his own confrontation with self-worth. This wasn't a platitude, but a hard-won recognition that emerged from years of choosing authenticity over security. Jung's personal journey validates his professional insights, that authentic self-worth requires periods of uncertainty, that choosing yourself often means disappointing others, and that the reward for this courage is not just personal fulfillment, but the ability to contribute your genuine gifts to the world. His willingness to risk everything for psychological truth gave him the authority to guide others through similar passages. Because Jung had walked through the fire of his own worth crisis, he could help others navigate their own journey from self-abandonment to authentic selfhood. Jung developed and endorsed specific practices for recognizing and transforming unconscious self-abandonment patterns into authentic self-worth. These aren't theoretical concepts, but practical tools that emerged from his own struggle and his work with thousands of patients. The key insight underlying all of Jung's practical approaches is that authentic self-worth is not something you build. It's something you uncover by removing the layers of adaptation and conditioning that have obscured your natural value. The daily worth check-in, developing conscious awareness. Jung's most fundamental practice involved developing what he called conscious awareness of the moment-to-moment choices between worth and wound. This requires regularly asking yourself, in this situation, am I choosing from my worth or my wound? This simple question helps develop what Jung called the observing ego, a part of yourself that can witness your patterns without immediately reacting or defending them. Most people make decisions from unconscious programming, but this practice creates space for conscious choice. Sarah began using this check-in during her lunch breaks, reviewing the morning's interactions and decisions. I realized I was making dozens of small, self-abandoning choices every day without noticing, she said, agreeing when I disagreed, apologizing for things that weren't my fault, minimizing my contributions in meetings. The practice isn't about judging your choices, but about developing awareness. Jung understood that consciousness itself is healing. When you can see a pattern clearly, you naturally begin to make different choices. Advanced practitioners learn to do this check-in in real time, pausing before responses to ask, what would I say, do if I truly believed I deserved better? This creates what Jung called conscious pause, a moment where authentic choice becomes possible. Boundary archaeology, excavating your self-abandonment patterns. Jung developed the practice of boundary archaeology, systematically examining your current relationships and life circumstances to identify where you've been accepting less than you deserve, not from judgment but from curiosity about your unconscious patterns. This practice involves creating what Jung called a psychological inventory, honestly assessing the different areas of your life. Relationships. Where am I consistently giving more than I receive? Which relationships drain my energy rather than nourish it? Where do I find myself walking on eggshells or managing others' emotions? Career. Where am I accepting less compensation, recognition, or respect than my contributions warrant? How do I respond when my ideas are dismissed or my work is undervalued? Family dynamics. What roles have I taken on that require me to be smaller than my authentic self? Where do I automatically accommodate others while suppressing my own needs? Friendships. Which friendships are based on my ability to listen, support, and accommodate rather than genuine mutual interest? Where do I find myself being the one who always reaches out first? The key is approaching this excavation with what Jung called curious compassion, rather than self-criticism. You're not looking for evidence of your weakness, but for understanding of how your survival strategies developed. Marcus discovered through this practice that he had unconsciously chosen a career path that kept him financially dependent on his father's approval, ensuring he could never fully assert his authentic values. I thought I was being practical, Marcus realized, but I was actually recreating childhood dynamics where my worth was tied to my father's satisfaction with my choices. The inner dialogue practice, developing self-compassion. Jung observed that most people struggling with self-worth have developed what he called an internal critic, a harsh, judgmental inner voice that constantly evaluates and finds them lacking. Transforming this inner dialogue is essential for authentic self-worth. The practice involves consciously developing a compassionate internal voice that speaks to you the way you would speak to someone you truly love and respect. This isn't positive affirmations or denial of problems. It's genuine internal kindness. Lisa began noticing how harshly she spoke to herself compared to how kindly she spoke to others. I would never tell a friend she was stupid for making a mistake, she realized. But I called myself stupid multiple times every day. Jung suggested literally changing the internal language you use with yourself instead of, I'm so stupid for missing that deadline. Try, I made a mistake with timing. What can I learn from this? Instead of, I'm too sensitive and emotional. Try, I have deep feelings and that's part of my authentic nature. Instead of, I should be grateful and stop wanting more. Try, it's healthy for me to recognize what I need and deserve. The practice requires what Jung called conscious intervention in your automatic internal responses. Most people are so identified with their inner critic that they don't recognize it as one voice among many possible internal voices. Advanced practitioners develop what Jung called internal advocacy, an inner voice that specifically supports their right to have needs, boundaries, and authentic desires. This internal advocate learns to interrupt self-abandoning thoughts and offer perspective that honors your inherent worth. Active imagination for self-worth. Jung's technique of active imagination provides powerful tools for healing self-worth wounds by engaging directly with your unconscious through visualization, dialogue, and symbolic exploration. One powerful exercise involves visualizing your authentic self making empowered choices. Jung suggested spending time each day imagining how your life might look if you made all decisions from genuine self-respect rather than fear of disapproval. Elena used this practice to explore her marriage dynamics. I would imagine myself responding to my husband's criticism from a place of calm self-worth rather than defensive anxiety, she said. At first it felt impossible, but gradually I began to embody that energy in real situations. Another active imagination technique involves dialoguing with the parts of yourself that believe you don't deserve better. Jung suggested literally having conversations with these aspects, asking them, "When did you first learn that I wasn't worthy of genuine love? What are you trying to protect me from by keeping my expectations low? What would you need to feel safe enough to let me value myself authentically?" These dialogues often reveal that self-abandonment patterns developed as survival strategies in situations where asserting your worth felt genuinely dangerous. The inner voices that maintain these patterns are usually trying to protect you from repeating old injuries. The settling inventory, conscious assessment. Jung developed the practice of creating what he called a settling inventory, honestly assessing areas where you've compromised your authentic needs and desires, not to create shame, but to develop awareness of your patterns and clarity about what changes would honor your true worth. This involves systematic examination of different life areas, relationships. List the ways you accommodate, compromise, or sacrifice in each significant relationship. Which of these feel genuine and mutual versus one-sided? Career. Identify where you accept less money, recognition, or respect than comparable colleagues. Where do you take on extra responsibilities without compensation? Living situation. How does your physical environment reflect or suppress your authentic preferences and needs? Social life. Which social activities drain rather than energize you? Where do you participate out of obligation rather than genuine interest? Self-care. What self-care practices have you abandoned to accommodate others' schedules or preferences? The key insight Jung emphasized is that settling becomes so habitual that you stop noticing it's happening. The inventory helps restore conscious awareness of choices that have become automatic. Jennifer's settling inventory revealed that she had been accepting last-minute date changes, paying more than her share of expenses, and consistently choosing restaurants based on her partner's preferences while never expressing her own. I had been so focused on being easygoing that I had made myself invisible in my own relationship, she realized. Energy tracking, using your body's wisdom. Jung recognized that the body often recognizes authentic worth choices before the mind does. He developed the practice of energy tracking, paying attention to how different relationships and situations affect your physical vitality and emotional energy. This practice involves checking in with your energy levels before and after different interactions. After spending time with certain people, do you feel energized or drained? Which activities leave you feeling more yourself versus depleted? What environments make you feel expansive versus contracted? Which conversations leave you feeling seen and valued versus invisible or criticized? Jung understood that authentic self-worth choices typically increase your energy while self-abandonment choices drain it. Your nervous system recognizes the difference between interactions that honor your nature and those that require you to be smaller than you are. Thomas discovered through energy tracking that he felt consistently depleted after family gatherings where he played his familiar role as the accommodating peacekeeper. I always left exhausted and vaguely resentful, he said, but I thought that was just how family visits were supposed to feel. By contrast, Thomas noticed that he felt energized after conversations where he could express his authentic opinions and interests, even when there was disagreement. His body was giving him information about which interactions honored his authentic self. Integration practice, making worth-based decisions. The ultimate practice, Jung endorsed, involves systematically making decisions from authentic self-worth rather than unconscious self-abandonment. This requires what he called conscious choice-making, pausing before decisions to ask what choice would honor your authentic nature. This practice starts with small, low-stakes decisions and gradually builds toward larger life choices. Small decisions: where to eat, what to watch, how to spend your free time. Medium decisions: which social events to attend, how to respond to criticism, when to say no. Large decisions: career changes, relationship boundaries, major life transitions. The key is learning to tolerate the discomfort of choosing authentically when it disappoints others or challenges familiar patterns. Jung understood that this discomfort is temporary but essential for developing genuine self-worth. These practical tools work because they address self-worth at the level where the problem actually exists, not in your circumstances but in your moment-to-moment relationship with yourself. As you develop the capacity to recognize and choose your authentic worth, your external circumstances naturally begin to reflect that internal shift. The practices require patience and self-compassion because you're rewiring neural pathways that may have been established over decades. But Jung's promise is that this work doesn't just change your life, it transforms your entire relationship with existence itself. Jung identified a predictable progression that occurs when individuals begin to recognize and transform their unconscious settling patterns into authentic self-worth. Understanding these stages helps navigate the journey and recognize that what feels like crisis is often actually breakthrough. The transformation isn't linear. People often cycle through these stages multiple times, each cycle deepening the integration. But recognizing the pattern can help you understand where you are in the process and what's needed for the next phase. Stage 1. The awakening, when the pattern becomes visible. The awakening begins with what Jung called a moment of recognition, often triggered by a particularly egregious example of self-abandonment, where you suddenly see the pattern that has been operating unconsciously for years or decades. This recognition often comes through contrast. Something happens that makes the gap between how you're being treated and how you deserve to be treated so obvious that you can't ignore it anymore. For Rachel, the awakening came during her birthday dinner when her husband spent the entire meal checking his phone and talking about work pressures. As she sat there making excuses for his behavior and minimizing her hurt, she suddenly saw herself clearly. A woman who had become so small in her own life that her birthday had become just another evening where her needs didn't matter. It was like a veil lifted, Rachel said. I could see how many times I had accommodated, excused, and shrunk myself to keep the peace. The pattern was suddenly so obvious I couldn't believe I had been unconscious of it. The awakening stage is characterized by a mixture of relief and horror. Relief because you finally understand why you've felt so depleted and unfulfilled. Horror because you recognize how pervasive the pattern has been and how much of your life has been shaped by unconscious self-betrayal. Jung observed that the awakening often feels like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. People describe feeling like they've been sleepwalking through their lives, making choices from an unconscious program rather than conscious intention. This stage can be triggered by various catalysts, a betrayal or disappointment that makes your self-abandonment impossible to ignore, a health crisis that forces you to prioritize your own needs, watching your children begin to replicate your patterns, a moment of comparison with someone who clearly values themselves, therapy, books, or conversations that provide language for your experience. The awakening is often accompanied by what Jung called compensatory dreams, unconscious material that shows you what you've been denying or avoiding. People often report dreams of being invisible, forgotten, or giving everything away until nothing remains. Stage 2. The excavation, confronting the depth of self-abandonment. The excavation stage involves the often painful process of examining how deeply self-abandonment patterns have shaped your life choices, relationships, and sense of identity. This stage can feel overwhelming as you realize the extent of your unconscious self-betrayal. Jung warned that this stage often feels worse than the unconscious suffering that preceded it, because now you're aware of what you've been doing to yourself. Consciousness brings responsibility, he noted, and responsibility can feel like a burden before it becomes empowerment. During excavation, people often discover relationships built entirely on their willingness to accommodate and give career choices made from fear rather than authentic interest. Financial patterns where they consistently undervalue their contributions. Family roles that require them to be smaller than their authentic self. Health issues that may be connected to chronic stress from self-abandonment. Marcus experienced the excavation as a psychological, archaeological dig where each layer revealed more ways I had betrayed myself. He discovered that his career choice, his marriage, his friendships, and even his hobbies had been shaped by his unconscious need to be acceptable to others rather than authentic to himself. This stage is characterized by grief, mourning the years spent abandoning yourself and the opportunities lost to unconscious patterns. People often report crying unexpectedly as they recognize how much they've sacrificed of their authentic nature. Jung emphasized that this grief is essential and healing. We must mourn what we've lost to unconscious living before we can fully embrace conscious choice, he wrote. The excavation stage allows you to see clearly what needs to change. The danger in this stage is becoming overwhelmed by the scope of the pattern and either returning to unconsciousness, maybe ignorance was better, or becoming paralyzed by the magnitude of change that seems necessary. Jung suggested focusing on awareness rather than immediate change during this stage. First, we must see clearly what is, he advised. Then we can choose what will be. Stage 3. The resistance, internal and external pushback. As you begin to make different choices based on authentic self-worth, you inevitably encounter pushback from people who are invested in your old patterns, as well as internal resistance from parts of yourself that equate self-worth with selfishness. Jung called this the resistance of the status quo, both internal and external forces that work to maintain familiar patterns even when those patterns are destructive. External resistance comes from people who benefited from your self-abandonment, partners who are used to your endless accommodation, family members who relied on you to manage their emotions, colleagues who are accustomed to your overwork and under demand for recognition, friends who are used to relationships where you consistently give more. The external resistance often takes the form of accusations that you've changed, become selfish, or are not the person you used to be. These accusations can trigger guilt and self-doubt, especially if you've spent your life defining yourself as caring and selfless. Internal resistance manifests as guilt when you prioritize your own needs, fear that you'll become demanding or difficult, anxiety about losing relationships if you stop accommodating self-doubt about whether you actually deserve better treatment, automatic impulses to return to familiar patterns when conflict arises. Elena described the resistance stage as feeling like I was learning to use muscles I had never developed. Setting boundaries felt foreign and uncomfortable, like speaking a language she barely knew. Jung observed that the resistance stage is where many people abandon their journey toward authentic self-worth. The discomfort of change combined with external pressure can make unconscious self-abandonment feel easier than conscious self-respect. The key to navigating resistance is understanding that it's temporary and predictable. Jung taught that what resists persists until it's consciously integrated. The resistance isn't evidence that you're on the wrong path. It's evidence that you're changing patterns that have been deeply entrenched. Success in this stage requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining your commitment to authentic self-worth, while also having compassion for the parts of yourself and others that are struggling with the change. Stage 4. The integration, developing new identity. The integration stage represents the gradual development of a new identity organized around authentic self-worth rather than adaptive self-abandonment. This stage involves learning to make consistent choices that honor your true nature while maintaining compassion for others and yourself. Jung described integration as the birth of the authentic self, not creating someone new, but uncovering who you were before you learn to abandon yourself for acceptance. During integration, you begin to experience natural boundaries that don't require constant effort, to maintain relationships that feel mutual and energizing rather than draining, career situations that honor your contributions and capacities, comfort with your own needs, feelings, and desires, the ability to give generously without depleting yourself, confidence that doesn't depend on others' approval. The integration process requires what Jung called conscious practice, repeatedly choosing authentic self-worth even when the old patterns feel more familiar. Jennifer experienced integration as finally feeling like the protagonist of my own life, rather than a supporting character in everyone else's story. She learned to make decisions based on what genuinely served her well-being, rather than what would keep others comfortable. Integration isn't a destination, but an ongoing practice. Jung emphasized that the individuated person continues to individuate throughout their lifetime. You don't complete the work of authentic self-worth. You deepen your capacity to live from it. This stage often involves what Jung called reconstruction, consciously choosing new relationships, career directions, and life circumstances that reflect your authentic worth rather than your old accommodation patterns. Stage 5. The embodiment, authentic self-worth as natural state. The embodiment stage occurs when authentic self-worth becomes your natural way of being rather than something you have to consciously work at. Your choices automatically reflect your inherent value, and you naturally attract relationships and opportunities that honor your authentic worth. Jung described embodiment as conscious living becoming unconscious competence. You no longer have to think about valuing yourself. It becomes as natural as breathing. People in the embodiment stage demonstrate effortless boundaries that don't feel defensive or aggressive. Natural ability to attract relationships and opportunities that honor their worth. Generous service that enhances rather than depletes them. Comfort with their own complexity and authentic expression. Leadership that inspires others to value themselves authentically. Sarah, after 3 years of conscious work, described embodiment as finally feeling at home in my own life. She had stopped attracting people who needed her to be small and began naturally connecting with those who appreciated her authentic fullness. The embodiment stage creates what Jung called a ripple effect. When you naturally value yourself, you give others permission to do the same. Your modeling of authentic self-worth becomes a gift to everyone around you. Jung observed that people in embodiment often become what he called wounded healers, individuals who can guide others through similar transformations because they've walked the path. themselves. Cycling through the stages, Jung emphasized that the transformation arc isn't a one-time journey, but a spiral process where you encounter each stage at deeper levels throughout your life. New situations, relationships, and challenges can trigger temporary returns to earlier stages, but each cycle builds upon previous integration. Understanding the predictable nature of this progression helps normalize the difficulties and provides hope during challenging phases. What feels like breakdown is often breakthrough preparing to happen. The ultimate insight Jung offered is that the journey toward authentic self-worth isn't just personal healing. It's a contribution to the healing of our collective human story. Every person who learns to truly value themselves helps heal the cultural patterns that created the self-worth epidemic in the first place. Jung identified several dangerous detours that can derail the journey toward authentic self-worth, often occurring when individuals misunderstand what genuine self-valuation actually means. These pitfalls are particularly seductive because they can feel like progress, while actually recreating the same underlying patterns in new forms. Understanding these shadow expressions of self-worth work is crucial because they can trap you in more sophisticated forms of self-abandonment while convincing you that you've achieved authentic self-value. Pitfall 1. Inflation, from self-abandonment to grandiosity. Jung's concept of inflation describes what happens when people swing from chronic self-abandonment to an inflated sense of their own importance, becoming demanding, entitled, or dismissive of others without achieving genuine self-worth. Inflation represents not authentic self-worth, but a defensive reaction against previous wound patterns. Instead of developing genuine self-respect, inflated individuals become addicted to external validation, control, or superiority over others. Michael exemplified this pitfall after recognizing his patterns of chronic self-abandonment in relationships. Instead of developing balanced self-worth, he swung to the opposite extreme, becoming hypercritical of partners, demanding constant attention and validation, and interpreting any disagreement as disrespect. "I thought I was finally valuing myself," Michael said, "but I was actually recreating the same neediness in a more aggressive form. I needed others to treat me like I was special to feel worthy, which isn't really different from needing others to like me by being self-sacrificing." Jung observed that inflation often masquerades as confidence, but can be distinguished from authentic self-worth by its defensive quality and its dependence on others' responses. Genuine self-worth is stable regardless of external circumstances, while inflation requires constant feeding through others' admiration or submission. Warning signs of inflation include feeling superior to others who haven't done the work, becoming intolerant of others' limitations or unconscious patterns, requiring special treatment or recognition to feel valued, interpreting others' boundaries or disagreements as attacks on your worth, using self-worth concepts to justify demanding or controlling behavior. The antidote to inflation is what Jung called conscious humility, recognizing that developing authentic self-worth is an ongoing process that requires genuine compassion for both yourself and others who are struggling with similar patterns. Pitfall 2. Spiritual bypassing, using self-worth concepts to avoid reality. Spiritual bypassing occurs when individuals use concepts of self-worth and authentic living to avoid dealing with practical realities, difficult emotions, or necessary action in their external circumstances. This pitfall involves using psychological or spiritual concepts as a way to feel superior to your problems rather than actually addressing them. Instead of doing the practical work of changing circumstances that don't honor your worth, you convince yourself that just recognizing your value is sufficient. Lisa fell into this pitfall after learning about Jung's concepts of authentic self-worth. Instead of addressing her genuinely problematic work situation, where she was being underpaid and overworked, she spent months doing inner work and affirmations while continuing to accept the same treatment. I convinced myself that if I just shifted my internal relationship to the situation, the external circumstances would change, Lisa said. But I was actually using spiritual concepts to avoid the anxiety of having difficult conversations with my boss or the risk of looking for a new job. Jung warned against using psychological insights to avoid practical action. The individuated person engages with the world as it is, he wrote, not as they wish it were. Spiritual bypassing in self-worth work often manifests as using meditation or inner work to avoid setting external boundaries, believing that changing your internal state eliminates the need for practical changes, judging others as unconscious rather than addressing how their behavior affects you. Using concepts of letting go to avoid advocating for yourself in relationships or career, believing that truly enlightened people don't need external validation or fair treatment. The antidote is what Jung called practical mysticism, combining inner work with appropriate external action that honors your authentic worth in the world as it actually exists. Pitfall 3. The pendulum swing, alternating between extremes. Many people fall into what Jung called the pendulum swing, alternating between extreme self-sacrifice and extreme selfishness, without finding the balanced middle path of authentic self-worth that honors both your own needs and genuine care for others. This pitfall occurs when you haven't developed the sophisticated emotional capacity to hold multiple needs simultaneously, yours and others, and instead swing between abandoning yourself and abandoning others. Rebecca's journey exemplified this pattern. After years of chronic self-abandonment in her marriage, she began setting boundaries but couldn't find the middle ground. She alternated between periods of extreme accommodation and periods where she became completely self-focused and dismissive of her husband's needs. "I didn't know how to care for myself while still caring for him," Rebecca said. "I only knew how to be completely selfless or completely selfish. I couldn't figure out how to honor both of our needs simultaneously." Jung observed that the pendulum swing often occurs when people mistake healthy selfishness, appropriate self-care, and self-advocacy for the kind of unhealthy selfishness that genuinely harms relationships. The pendulum swing manifests as periods of extreme accommodation followed by periods of extreme self-focus, difficulty finding compromise or middle ground solutions, all or nothing thinking about needs and boundaries, guilt about self-care followed by resentment about self-sacrifice, relationships that feel like battlegrounds rather than partnerships. The resolution requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension rather than choosing one extreme or the other. Pitfall 4. Isolation, mistaking independence for self-worth. Some individuals mistake authentic self-worth for not needing anyone, withdrawing from relationships rather than learning to be in relationship while maintaining their authentic nature. This pitfall involves confusing healthy independence with defensive isolation. Instead of learning to receive care while maintaining boundaries, isolated individuals protect themselves by avoiding meaningful connection altogether. David fell into this pattern after recognizing how much he had abandoned himself in previous relationships. Instead of learning to be authentic within relationship, he concluded that relationships themselves were the problem and withdrew into what he called self-sufficient living. "I thought I was finally valuing myself by not depending on anyone," David said. "But I was actually recreating the same emotional starvation I had experienced in codependent relationships. I was just starving alone instead of starving with someone. Jung understood that authentic self-worth naturally leads to healthier relationships, not isolation from relationship. The individuated person is more capable of genuine intimacy, he wrote, not less. Isolation as a pitfall manifests as pride in not needing anyone or anything from others, avoiding vulnerability or emotional intimacy, using self-sufficiency to avoid the risk of disappointment or hurt, judging people in relationships as codependent or weak, creating identity around being independent rather than authentic. The antidote is recognizing that authentic self-worth includes the capacity to both give and receive care, to be both independent and interdependent as situations require. Pitfall 5. Perfectionism, making self-worth another performance. Perhaps the most subtle pitfall is when the journey toward authentic self-worth becomes another area for perfectionism and self-criticism, creating new ways to feel inadequate based on how well you're doing self-worth rather than accepting it as your natural state. This pitfall transforms self-worth from a recognition of your inherent value into another project to be mastered, creating the same performance pressure that created self-abandonment patterns in the first place. Jennifer fell into this trap by constantly monitoring her progress, criticizing herself for moments of old patterns, and trying to achieve perfect self-worth rather than accepting the ongoing nature of the process. I started judging myself for every moment I reverted to people-pleasing, Jennifer said. I was treating self-worth like another thing I had to be good at instead of recognizing it as something I already possessed. Jung warned that the individuated person doesn't achieve perfection, they achieve authenticity. Self-worth isn't a destination you reach, but a natural state you remember and return to. Perfectionism in self-worth work manifests as harsh self-criticism for moments of old patterns, comparing your progress to others or to idealized standards, trying to earn self-worth through perfect self-care or boundary setting, using self-worth concepts to create new forms of self-judgment, believing that authentic people never struggle or doubt themselves. The antidote is what Jung called imperfect authenticity, accepting that the journey toward genuine self-worth includes setbacks, confusion, and ongoing learning. Integration, avoiding the pitfalls. Jung's ultimate insight about these pitfalls is that they all stem from the same fundamental misunderstanding, treating self-worth as something to be achieved rather than something to be recognized. Authentic self-worth is humble, inclusive, and naturally generous. When the journey toward self-valuation makes you harsh, isolated, superior, or perfectionistic, you've likely fallen into one of these shadow expressions rather than achieving genuine integration. The path through these pitfalls requires what Jung called middle way consciousness, the capacity to hold complexity, nuance, and paradox, rather than swinging between extremes or seeking simple solutions to complex psychological challenges. Remember, you already possess the worth you're seeking to develop. The journey isn't about creating something new, but about removing the obstacles to recognizing what was always true. Sarah's story exemplifies the complete journey from unconscious self-abandonment to authentic self-worth that Jung outlined in his Individuation process, showing how this transformation affects not just the individual, but everyone in their sphere of influence. When Sarah first walked into therapy at 45, she embodied every pattern Jung identified. In his work on self-worth shadows, she had spent 2 decades in a marriage where she consistently prioritized her husband David's needs, career, and preferences, while her own dreams and desires remained perpetually on the back burner. I genuinely believed I was being a good wife and person, Sarah reflected years later. I thought my willingness to sacrifice made me virtuous, loving, and mature. I didn't recognize that I was systematically abandoning myself. The life before unconscious self-betrayal. Sarah's marriage exemplified what Jung called unconscious complementarity, where two people unconsciously agree to maintain each other's psychological patterns. David had learned to expect Sarah's endless accommodation, while Sarah had learned to find identity and purpose through being needed and self-sacrificing. Their relationship had an unspoken agreement. David would be the important one with the demanding career and individual needs, while Sarah would be the supportive one who adapted, accommodated, and ensured his comfort. This arrangement felt natural to both of them because it matched their unconscious beliefs about love and relationships. Sarah's own interests, friendships, and career aspirations had been gradually eroded over the years. When opportunities arose for her to pursue graduate school, travel with friends, or take on leadership roles in her community, there was always a reason why David's needs took precedence. I became an expert at convincing myself that what I wanted wasn't really important, Sarah said. I told myself that marriage required sacrifice, that love meant putting your partner first, that my desires were selfish or impractical. Jung would have recognized Sarah's pattern as what he called anima possession, where the feminine aspect of the psyche becomes identified solely with nurturing others at the expense of the self. Sarah had lost contact with her inner masculine capacity for self-advocacy, goal pursuit, and healthy selfishness. The catalyst. When the pattern became visible. Sarah's awakening came during what seemed like a minor incident, but revealed the entire structure of her self-abandonment. She had spent months planning to return to school for her master's degree in education, researching programs, saving money, and preparing applications. When she finally shared her plans with David, his response was immediate dismissal. He listed practical concerns, the cost, the time commitment, the disruption to their routines, and concluded that it didn't make sense for their family. Sarah found herself automatically agreeing, apologizing for even considering something so disruptive, and abandoning her plans within minutes. But as she hung up the phone, David was traveling for work. Something inside Sarah recoiled. For the first time, she clearly saw the pattern. She was apologizing for wanting something for herself, while David regularly made unilateral decisions about his career, travel, and pursuits, without consulting her at all. I had what Jung called an enantiodromia, a complete reversal of psychological attitude, Sarah said. Suddenly I could see 20 years of this same dynamic playing out in hundreds of different situations. The descent, confronting the depth of self-abandonment. Sarah's journey into consciousness was initially devastating. As she began to examine her life with clear eyes, she discovered how completely she had organized her identity around being acceptable to David rather than authentic to herself. Her friendships had been neglected or abandoned. When they required time, David preferred her to spend with him. Her career had remained in safe, part-time positions that wouldn't compete with his professional ambitions. Even her preferences for food, entertainment, and vacation destinations had been so consistently overridden that she had stopped having opinions about them.